Kia ora, tēnei te mei ki a koutou, ki a tātou kua ui mai nei. E mi tēnei ki ngā kai karakia, kua karakia, me ngā kai waka-aere, kua waka-aere. E mi tēnei ki waipapa taumatarau, me Ngāti wātua. He uri tēne o te atiawa me taranaki. It's my privilege to be chairing this session. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So I know you haven't tuned in to listen to me, so I'm just going to make an effort to be a little bit of a frame so we can even more appreciate the amazingness that is Hirini Kaa, who will be presenting the keynote today. The theme of the conference is communities, books, and the power of words. And obviously we wish we could be in person, but perhaps the virtual space is a little bit like books in that it can produce communities despite us all being in different places. Maybe the theme of the conference today is, well, over the next couple of days, is partly about what books mean to communities. Maybe it's about how communities participate in the production of books, and how engaging with a book can itself produce communities. And perhaps these are three ways that the theme of the conference connect to the kōrero we're going to be hearing now. In this case, of course, the community produced by a book, but also participating actively in the production of books and its own community is Te Hāhi Mihinare. It is my great pleasure to welcome the Venerable Dr. Hirini Kaa, who is, of course, repping Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu and Rongowhakaata. He's an historian and an Anglican minister, which I think we can all agree means books squared. Two bookish typed things to have your feet in. He's the Archdeacon for mātauranga Māori at the Pihopatanga o Aotearoa. Hirini and I have known each other for quite a while. We have family ties. I think my mum went to training college with his auntie, and you know how it is. And my side on the West Coast and his side on the East Coast keep bumping into each other each generation. And it's been my pleasure to meet Hirini first as, I think, a master's student 1,000 years ago when we were young, free, single, hot and pretty, who knows, back at Auckland University. And so it does feel really nice that Auckland University has called us both back, even though we both left Auckland University at the present. But also we of course have ties through Te Whānau Te Pauhiri Kōrero, the Māori Historians Association, which is, I think, one of the ways that I've gotten to know Hirini's work, but also Hirini as a thinker, and a really important thinker, I think, in Te Ao Māori. And also as a really nice person who's quite hilarious, which is a massive bonus. So Hirini is not just a man of books, but he's a man of a particular book, Te Hāhi Mihinare, the Māori Anglican Church that Bridget Williams Books published. It's been a smash hit. He's the co-winner of the Ernest Scott Prize, which is a massive prize for contributions to history of Australia and New Zealand. It was a finalist in the 2021 Ockham Book Awards. And if you like suspense, he's actually been shortlisted for 2 New Zealand Historical Association prizes. So watch this space because that conference is unfolding later this week. And so we'll get to find out how he went again. His book, of course, builds on his 2014 PhD from the University of Auckland, but in many ways builds on the legacy of his whānau, the legacy of the environment in which he grew up, his people, his community, and also the hard work that he's been doing in this space, thinking about being a man of the book in a number of ways and thinking about that in relation to communities and the power of words. So, Ehua, I'll turn it over to you and then I'll stop being smiling and start getting grumpy when you hit about 10:15, just so everybody knows. That's when my other side will come out, so that we have plenty of time for kōrero, because I know there'll be so many questions and people seeking to engage with your work today. Kia ora.
Tohia ki te rangi, tohia ki te whenua, tohia ki te ngākara te tangata. Ia ha te menui o te ao, ko te aroha. Ko te aroha te atu e tuti mea tātou katoa. Ti hei mauri ora. He te mihi atu ki a koe te ahorangi e alasi te hoa. mō tō mihi mahana ki au I te ata nei, tēnei te mihi. Kia korua ngā kai mihi I te ata nei, kia koe Michael e Henry, tēnā korua mō te mihi kia mātou, nāku te he, kaore au e taia ki te wā whakatau, engari ko tai mai e nai nei. Nō reira, kei te mihi kia korua, ki ngā kai whakahaere hoki, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Hikirangi te maunga, ko Waipu te awa, ko Ngāti Pautiwi, ko Hirini Kaa hau, he horore mōku ki te mihi atu kia koutou, ki te tukuna te kauhau kia koutou, I te ata nei, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, Alice, thank you so much for your wonderful, generous welcome as always. I was a little intimidated when I heard you were going to introduce me because you speak always so well. I'm like, oh, it's like, yeah, I'll just try and live up to whatever you laid down for me. So thank you. I also have to apologize. I missed the whakatau this morning, which is terrible due to technical glitches. But always, I know and honour Michael, Henry, for you to welcome everybody this morning. And it's such an honour to be here amongst you all today at this conference as we gather, as Alice has said, for this wānanga, for this kōrero around communities, books and lives and how people come together through these. I'm going to start my PowerPoint now. I'm not just a person of the book, but of the PowerPoint now. I hope it won't be death by PowerPoint, but I find, particularly for our friends from Australia, but using te reo Māori and words in te reo, it's better to put them on the screen so people can kind of capture a sense of them anyway. So I'll do that, and hopefully without blowing up the interweb. Get there very shortly. Okay, hopefully you can see this presentation. Look at Alice. Is that? Come on. I can only see Alice, I can only see your face. I'm relying on you to laugh at my jokes dutifully and everything else, please. There's a crisp $5 note in it for you at the end here somewhere as well. Not real money, mana money, obviously. It's like I said, it's a real pleasure and honour to be asked to share this keynote for this conference this morning. I'd like to acknowledge the organisers, the amazing work you've done, the steadfast work you've done, the constant shift in planning, of course. You had some brilliant plan Bs, plan Cs, and now I think we're down to like plan H somewhere along the way due to COVID. But I'd like to acknowledge your great work and creative work as well, some of the options you were coming up with. But now we're live on Zoom. I'd also like and feel that I need to acknowledge my employers, the Māori Anglican Church. Yes, I'm even wearing the costume today. If I was representing the University of Auckland, I think I'd wear a pirate outfit or whatever. I can't remember what we used to wear as an appropriate uniform. But this is my current work, working for the church. So I thought I'd double down with the background, with the uniform, why not? Do everything and with the topic. And of course, I have to promote the book as I go, because not that I'm afraid of the publishers, but I have tremendous, almost all-filled respect for them. So I can't not promote the book, and obviously my background is a constant promotion. Also, a virtual background in Auckland at these times is the closest you're going to get to a haircut, and you don't want to see this hair unleashed at present. So this is the best I'm going to do, but it's also obviously tremendous work with the cover. Bridget Williams did some fantastic. They made my work look amazing and be amazing. Got it above the mediocrity I was kind of aiming for. And I've got to admit too, I'm in, now I work for the Anglican Church, I'm often in preaching mode, which means captive audiences, and I can talk as long as I want and use my authoritative presence. I'm not used to this academic discipline, so I'll try really hard, and also Ngāti Porou. and we love our own eloquence at times. So I'll try my best to be disciplined in terms of time. But yes, Alice will certainly kick in at some stage as we go through our kōrero today. And I'm going to talk to you today about He Rawiri. I have a Rawiri here, this book here. It doesn't do very well on the small screen, which is what I've left you after the PowerPoint. But this Rawiri in particular, this small prayer book, I'm going to talk to this particular copy of this particular book for a little bit at the moment. And this is what a Rawiri is. This is a picture of my nan, my grandmother, Hohepene Whānga Kaa. She was a woman of great strength, of great wit, of great, she made the best bread ever in the universe, of course. Everyone's nan did, though. But I claim objectively she made the best bread ever. She was a huge figure in our lives, and I want to start this kōrero with her because this is her Rawiri I'm holding in my hand, her prayer book, her personal copy that I have inherited down through time. Hohepene Whānga was, like I said, a woman of greatness. Please excuse my lack of humility here, talking about my own grandmother, and therefore in some ways about myself, but no, what are you going to do? But also she was Ngāti Kahungunu, and she was Ngāti Kahungunu blue blood. This is her great-grandfather, Ihaka Whānga. Ihaka Whānga was the paramount chief of the Mahia Peninsula. That's south of Gisborne, the bit that pokes out, the bit that the US military is currently firing rockets off. But the Mahia Peninsula, absolutely stunning spot, and Ihaka Whānga ruled from there over his people, with his people Rākai Pāka. And my grandmother is descended from his third wife, Te Paia, who was from Whangara Ngāti Kanohi, and she was very proud descendant of him. And his oldest son, Epaniah, and then his oldest son, Tihi, and then Nan was Tihi's oldest descendant as well. So she comes from the senior line from this great chief, and we're very proud, even though this is the Lindau picture, painted with those particular Lindau features. We are very proud of our whakapapa. It also meant, and I'm going to make this claim, and again with some kind of pretense at humility, that my nan was a woman of great tapu and mana, partly through her descent. Mana can be inherited and achieved, as Uncle Api Mahuika said, and through the seniority of her descent lines, my grandmother inherited certain features, characteristics around tapu. The old way of thinking, I believe, was that the more senior your line, the closer you were to ngā atua, to the gods, the ancestors, the guardians, and therefore your tapu could be raised, elevated, and say it in that way. I'm going to make a claim here that Christianity actually, and I think in some ways quite deliberately from our point of view, kind of flattened that out in quite some way. We're much less perhaps practicing of that differentiation between individuals based on our descent lines. Now, having said that, there are particular examples like King Tuheitia, where we would obviously acknowledge very carefully. But I think now we're all descended from chiefs, and we acknowledge that. And that's, I kind of ascribe to the universalism that came with Christianity, everyone being created equal. And I think there's obviously some good parts to that, I think. My point is, this book was her book. This book was her personal property. This book she handled with love and care and affection every day of her life. And this book is imbued with some of the qualities, some of the personal, but also I'd say spiritual qualities that was handed down to her through her lines of descent. That's Mahia. where Iaka Whanga came from, where my nan came from. But she ended up marrying into Ngāti Porou, marrying my grandfather up near the East Cape there. And this is a picture of my grandmother, Sophie, and her husband, the Reverend Hirini Kaa. Yes, I'm a third generation Anglican priest. I either lack imagination or we have a very strong calling upon us, one of the two, or didn't want to do a real job. There's some options there as to why I'm wearing the collar today. But that's the whakapapa I come from. But it also meant that this prayer book played a very important part in her life, in their lives. Every night they would gather, the whole whānau, that includes my father, their son, their 10th child. They would gather together for prayer from this book. At tangihanga, the very sad passing of loved ones, they would use this book. At weddings, at celebrations, at the big moments in their lives, this book would be present, would be part of their lives. It was important. It could meet those needs. It could be part of that journey of them as a community, as a whānau, and their lives together. This book, for me, is what we might call a taonga, a treasure. But I kind of want to talk about that, what the nature of a book can be, I think, from a perspective. I'd hesitate to say a Māori perspective, because Alice has already pointed out that West Coast, East Coast, old school, new school, and obviously differences between iwi in terms of our thinking. So I hesitate to say Māori. I'm going to say this is a Rākai Pāka, Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Porou, Rongowhakaata view of these, what constitutes a taonga in relation to a book and books. First of all, we've got to kind of define taonga. That's a photo of me sitting next to Justice Sir Joe Williams. It's the only photo I've got from that day where I wasn't gazing at him in adoration, doing my fanboy look. I'm pretty sure I grew a beard after that to try and impress him, but I did the same with James Bellich, and he ended up supervising my PhD, so sycophancy works, trust me, all the time. But Joe Williams, I think, is one of the greatest minds in Te Ao Māori today, the greatest intellects we have. And his thinking is embedded and imbued in the Waitangi Tribunal report, Ko Rawiri Te Tangata, this is New Zealand. Y262 is the Waitangi Tribunal nomenclature for this report, as in the 262nd report, but it was an amalgam of lots of reports, which they kind of lumped into this one number. It's a huge report, again, authored by Justice Sir Joe Williams when he was head of the Māori Land Court, chair of the Waitangi Tribunal. It is a report, an all-of-government report, that talks about where the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, is going. We've been using it to resolve historic issues for several decades now, but that obviously wasn't what it was designed for. My tipuna didn't sign the treaty in Te Tiriti in 1840 in order to resolve historical grievances, except with Ngāpuhi, but that's a whole other story. My tipuna signed Te Tiriti in order to think about the future. And so Y262 is about the future of Aotearoa, where we're headed, and where Te Tiriti can fit into this future. It's quite an amazing document, along with the Rawiri, Paipera Tapu, the Bible. I'd say it's my third very important text, although I could get sacked if I do that actual comparison. So let's just say it's up there. But I'm not being, I'm not breaking any rules of doctrine. It's about the place of mātauranga Māori in New Zealand life going into the future. It's about our intellectual foundations, about who we are, about who we want to be, about who we will be. All these really big questions are in Y262, and it's across a whole range, everything from international instruments, space treaties, through to plants, through to art. It's just huge, a huge work. And I recommended reading. In fact, I think it should be compulsory reading, but don't read the whole thing. Ignore the bits that look like lawyers are into it, but the other bits are good. But as it says at the end, it's about the treaty moving from a breach contract to an exchange of solemn promises. It's big talk, big ideas, big thinking. And I use it as a guide for several things. And one of the important ideas in here is ideas around taonga. What is taonga? First, I'll jump to mātauranga Māori. Mātauranga is an important concept. Mātau to know, ranga to weave, mātauranga to weave knowing, to weave knowledge, epistemologies, ways of knowing, not just what our ancestors knew, but why they thought that way and how we can apply that to our current and future contexts. Hirini Mead, as you can see here, talks about it's Māori knowledge, complete with values and attitudes. The Tribunal talks about Māori way of knowing. The great Ngāi Tahu philosopher, Te Maire Tau, talks about what gives point and meaning to Māori knowledge. And importantly, when we're talking about Māori, obviously we're talking about, a construct. There was no Māori, there was Ngāti Porou and everyone who wanted to be Ngāti Porou. It's a more traditional way of thinking, and well, still is. But iwi thinking, particularly as we move into a settlement, post-settlement identity, iwi have continued to evolve, and we continue to refine our thinking. As we didn't do 6,000 years crossing Te Wāne Nui a Kiwa remaining static. We continue to evolve and challenge and change as we go in terms of our understandings. That includes iwi. And in terms of Y262 and the thinking in this report, it talks about this idea of taonga. Now, taonga means anything precious, anything of value. In Te Tiriti o Waitangi, rangatira or chiefs are guaranteed the rights to retain o rātou taonga, their treasures, is one way it's been translated. And so taonga can be anything precious, and as the Tribunal talks about, it can be intellectual properties as much as physical properties, ways of thinking, knowledge. In fact, in some ways in that report is more important than physical, particularly and alongside natural resources. But it talks about taonga being the intellectual creation of Māori. The report also gives some other criteria for understanding what constitutes a taonga, or a kind of Māori precious objects. So it has to have that mātauranga Māori, that Māori knowledge and ways of knowing embedded in it. It has to have, according to Y262, whanaungatanga and whakapapa. A whānau is the family unit. As family, as kinship, as ties is much bigger than the European nuclear family, different from that, broader. Whanaungatanga is the practice of those kinship ties, of those relationships. And whakapapa is a way of organising those relationships, I think, is a handy way of thinking about it. So within our knowledge systems, our mātauranga, this whanaungatanga, this kinship, this relationship is the defining principle, as Y262 says. It apportions rights and obligations amongst the living because of our obligations to one another through those connections, and affirms the connections to the dead, because they're not just dead in the past and gone, they continue to be with us now and into the future. It explains people's relationships with creation, with the land, with the waters, with every aspect of the world around us, animals, things living and not living. The Māori definition of what's alive is not the same as a Western definition. A bird can be alive, a rock can be alive, a mountain can be alive. We have different conceptualizations of what constitutes even life and living. And that comes with ancestors, part of these treasures. Those who've gone before us are imbued in these treasures as one of the kind of preconditions to make this a taonga. Mauri, Hirini Mead, again, the great Ngāti Awa scholar, says Mauri is life force. And he says that a taonga needs to have that aspect to it. It needs to have, he calls it taha wairua, which you might, again, sorry, these translations are very imperfect, very brief, but taha wairua, the spiritual side, the spiritual aspect or dimension to them. It needs to be imbued with that, which is, you know, a pretty subjective experience, obviously. But he makes a distinction. If it doesn't, then it's an artifact. If it does, then it's a taonga. Again, this is kind of getting into this Māori worldview of, you know, the spiritual, the mundane, blending together. There's not necessarily a distinction amongst them. But also the Māori comes with these ancestors, the stories that are imbued within this. Not necessarily a function of age or antiquity, but of what has been invested into these items, into these things. And the Māori is an important part of that. The other concept they say is required for this to be a taonga is kaitiakitanga. Kaitiaki guardian, kaitiakitanga, the practice of guardianship. These artifacts, these items, objects, require a living community whose obligation is to protect the Māori of this taonga. So they need to have a living community around them in order for them to be a taonga, responsible for them, to have that obligation to them. They make the distinction in the report between taonga works, because taonga is a very broad concept. Radio spectrums have been identified and agreed upon as taonga because Māori have an interest in them. Yes, our ancestors didn't know there were radio spectrums in 1840, but neither did the Crown, and yet the Crown's willing to claim ownership of it, so can we. So these ideas of taonga can be very broad. They talk about taonga works, which again, objects, things, I think is a way of thinking about it. And taonga derived works, they're saying things without whanaungatanga, without those relationships, without mauri or spiritual aspect, without kaitiakitanga, without a community of guardianship, and without mātauranga, without being embedded by the intellectual power and knowledge of the Māori world. So these are the criteria around what constitutes a taonga. And we're talking about books. We're talking about a particular type of book in particular here today. And so thinking through that, is this a taonga? How have communities thought about that? How does that idea work with books as we think about them? And in particular, this book, Te Rawiri. Now I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because old white guy's coming. Trigger warning. But I'll get through as quickly as, I'll get through it. Too much time on Twitter, my apologies. But let's talk about the Rawiri, this book and its origins. Literacy and Māori is a very important, complicated, dynamic relationship. Obviously, the Church Missionary Society, who were the first Europeans to come to this land and to have a permanent settlement up at Rohi Rangihaua in the Bay of Islands, with their evangelical beliefs, believed in the power of individual personal conversion, which is one very complicated topic, and therefore the importance of translation. Māori needed to be able to engage with these texts personally in order to fully understand and comprehend the faith that was going to transform them. By transform, the CMS often meant rid them of being Māori, but of course Māori didn't think that way. But it was the importance of literacy in this. 1814, the first permanent settlement established up there. 1816, they've established a school. So the importance of literacy is demonstrated very early on. Estimates obviously vary, but saying by the 1840s, half of Māori could read, which is quite spectacular, particularly, and often this is a good stage one quotable, but compared to say English literacy rates at a similar time. So Māori, we embraced within our mātauranga literacy. There's critique, of course, of the power of literacy and its impact on us as communities. Kuni Jenkins Kaa, my auntie, writes about how the missionaries used literacy and others used literacy as attempts to control us. And of course, education was contested space, always has been, still certainly is today. And so they taught a particular type of literacy. But of course, we didn't confine ourselves to what they wanted from us. And Tony Ballantyne, for example, talks about the huge power of literacy. Lindsay Head says in the 19th century, all the major resistance movements, so resistance movements to settlers, to colonization, were empowered by the Bible. And I think that's actually pretty, it's hard to find examples that weren't, particularly, if we go within certain bands of time. But the Ringatu, Kingitanga, the King movement, certainly inspired by literacy and by a particular form of literacy that they're past. So while it was an attempt to oppress perhaps, it was also liberative and powerful for us as a people. The oldest, whitest guy I'm going to have, Thomas Cranmer, a bit of a genius, wrote the Book of Common Prayer. Prayer books are very important. I just make a quick split because, people don't really know these things, because why would anyone anymore? But the Bible is like over here. I've got several next to me. The Bible is the text passed down from Old and New Testament, etc., etc. The prayer book was Cranmer, for example, and he'd following a long ancient tradition, going back through the Catholic Church and Orthodox churches, of course, taking scripture, the Bible, and turning it into usable forms. So taking the Bible and saying, right, we want to baptize a child, we want to marry a couple. How are we going to do that? Well, let's use scripture and rework its form into a prayer book. So there's full of the Bible, just in more workable forms, is a really brutal way to think about it. But as Anglicans too, the Roman Catholics have the magisterium. You can go find their list of things they believe in. Generally, the Anglican Church, the church in England, said, well, the prayer book will do it. This sums up what we believe. If you want to know what an Anglican believes, look in this book. It'll tell you all you need to know. Cranmer, of course, didn't finish it. He got burnt to death by Mary I. I've been to the spot where he was burnt to death. There was an ice cream cart parked on top of it, which I wasn't sure what lesson I was supposed to derive from that. But he died 1556 or something like that. The book was finally finished 1662 with many revisions, and that's pretty much the version that got embedded in English society and remained embedded in English society. It was the only form of worship, let's say, in a lot of ways, until at least the 1820s, when with the Catholic emancipation. And really, through to today, in some areas of English society, the prayer book of 1662 remains a kind of a intellectual and literary foundation for their society. So a very important book, prayer book. And of course, you combine literacy with the prayer book and the Church Missionary Society, the Church of England's outworkings, and you're going to get it translated when it comes here. Starting in 1820, 1833, William Yates does a short run in Sydney. As our amazing friend Michael Stevens points out, easier to get from Auckland to Bluff via Sydney than directly. So, Sydney wasn't that much out of the way for printing. 1839, William Puckey and William Williams translate what they call a small prayer book. So they take aspects of the Book of Common Prayer and they produce the small prayer book. This next figure, though, by 1842, this book, which had become known as the Rawiri, they'd printed up to 47,000 copies and distributed them. The Māori population at the time was estimated at between 80,000 to 100,000. So they printed 47,000 copies of this prayer book and disseminated them. I've seen the figures kind of firsthand of distribution, particularly from St. John's College, where they were Meadowbank, where they're distributed from, and it looks pretty accurate. I checked that several times because it's such an astounding figure. By 1842, George Augustus Selwyn, the first Anglican bishop, comes over from England, and he wants to kind of align things. William Colenso is doing his particular William Colenso thing around the place, including with the language, and Selwyn wants to get it all lined up. So they go to Waimate to the mission station and establish a translation syndicate, which is a huge moment for the Māori world. There, our orthography is cemented in, including the letters NG and WH are being agreed to as letters in our alphabet. Like, just some quite amazing people. Yes, with some horrible, horrible views at times, and you don't want to be quoting them too often, but also their engagement with the reo was just pretty astounding. And their commitment to it for whatever motivations they had. By 1852, you get 15,000. The full Rawiri is printed in Sydney by the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, in London, and sent out here to Aotearoa. And it's printed by SPCK ever since then until the last run, which this was part of in 1951. So this book and every Rawiri around the country was last printed in 1951. I have no idea, but I suspect there are hundreds, if not thousands of these in Māori homes around the country. Probably the vast majority of Māori don't really know what they are anymore, but it was Nan's or Papa's book, and they've got it lying around in their house today. Paul Parkinson, who's done some amazing work on this actually, talks about the Book of Common Prayer, expressive the liturgy of the colonial powers, arguably more important for converted Māori than were the scriptures, for it was used as the quotidian text. It's an interesting argument, and I think there's some justification to it, that actually the prayer book was more impactful and influential than the Bible. But remember what I said earlier, it doesn't really matter in some ways, because this is scripture kind of retold in various forms. The Psalms are in here, bits of scripture are wound through here. It's an interpretation of scripture as well. But from the Māori world, it's a slightly different story, of course. Mohi Ture, who's in that bottom picture there, he was a tohunga, embedded, taught in our ancient whare whanaungatanga, carver, composer of haka, mōteatea, knew whakapapa, our astronomy, our mātauranga, our traditional knowledge. Quite a intimidating individual at the same time, and the second Ngāti Porou to be ordained into the Anglican Church. Very much the first Māori to become Anglican ministers were tohunga. In some ways, the roles were just renamed and redefined for the times. And Mohi Ture was just spectacular. Wrote hundreds, thousands of pages in Te Reo Māori. His work, I think, remains one of the great, largely unknown intellectual traditions in the Māori world, but also quite liked a good fight, literally. So wasn't one of those. Probably would have been before a disciplinary committee in the university fairly quickly. And that's Leonard Williams above him, the son of William Williams. They needed a broader range of names, I feel, and they worked very closely together in terms of, and Mohi Ture worked with William Williams and Hirini Kaa and other of these first tohunga / priests, worked with the translators to be informed, seen their work in a Turnbull in terms of how they help shape the translation, the ideas, because these Pākehā translators were looking for inspiration, for information, and these were the people to give it to them. And there's differences though. The prayer book is more conservative. Peter Wenzel in his work talks about that in the Bible. So in the Bible, priest is translated as tohunga, which is again one who reads the signs. It's the ancient form of knowledge holder. So to call a priest that, well, that's one thing. In the prayer book, they use piriti, a straight transliteration, much less loaded, perhaps less powerful, one might say, and a deliberate choice as well. So there's this idea, but again, the prayer book was wrapped in doctrine for the Anglican Church, whereas the Bible differently so. This needed to be word for word. The Bible, not quite so much. I just love this quote from Laman Sane, the Gandhian missiologist, just his kind of idea around the notion of what it took for these missionaries to engage in this translation work, how it wasn't just an objective or even exploitative process of, reworking language in order to control, that actually they had to enter into world. Language is the intimate, articulate expression of culture and synonymous with culture, and missionary adaptation of the vernacular was tantamount to adopting Indigenous cultural criteria for the message. You can think what you want about that, but I just like it as an idea, and it was happening all around the world at the time as well. The idea, though, that this was a bunch of white missionaries running around the country with these prayer books telling Māori what to do, using it as a form of control, was incorrect. The large majority of these books were taken by Māori to Māori communities. New Zealand, in the early to mid-19th century, was not a great place in terms of transportation, with or without groundswell blocking up the traffic. 1834, 6 European, this is official CMS, so Anglican records, 6 European missionaries, no native agents, according to them. 1844, 12 European missionaries and almost 300 kai whakaako, or Māori native agents, Māori evangelists. 1854, 23 missionaries, 1 clergy, roto waitoa, and up to 558 Māori evangelists. Taking this book into their own communities and working with the communities in their own way through their own understandings. It's important to think about that process, how this book is disseminated, how the meanings are understood, even almost despite where it was translated in that process, how it's actually worked out to the communities is important. 1833, Henry Williams talks about encountering a group of Māori who he didn't think had encountered Pākehā before, which would have been pretty common, 1833, who knew hymns and parts of the prayer book, but they used it differently. They didn't do it as he would have done it, but already it was getting far ahead of the handful of Pākehā missionaries around the country. And of course, I'm going to give you the Ngāti Porou example of that because, well, why wouldn't you? Piripi tau mātākura, our ancestor, escaped the hospitality of my in-laws in the north and the invitation to dinner, and returned to our people in 1834 with the gospel. This is our story as told by Mohi Ture, who I'd referred to previously, based on oral traditions which he wrote down in 1911. Piripi tau mātākura returns. Notably, one of the first acts he does as he does this whanaunga, does this sharing, learning, discourse with his people. As he shares this new message, he uses the Rawiri, the Book of Common Prayer. And he uses the prayer of general confession. This is a very specific quote from Mohi Ture, which begins in English, Almighty and most merciful Father, we have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. Always entertains me in 1834, our people would have had no idea what a sheep was or looked like, much less a lost one. But, the idea is there. But importantly, a confession, a admission of straying, of sin. Sin is really, in the Jewish tradition, as I understand it, not so much being bad as not fulfilling your potential, not meeting the mark. From a Māori worldview, this is very important. This is the idea of tika, doing things correctly, is extremely important. So this would have appealed to them greatly, and Alice is, okay, 10 minutes. And this would appeal to them greatly, this idea of tika. of keeping things in line and correct. Because again, we lived in a world full of these forces where if you strayed from the correct path, it would end in death for you. This is all the process of this book traveling through our people, of it engaging with our people, entering our people's lives, and us understanding it in our own way. And so why is it called Rawiri? I've been calling it Rawiri all the way through. Rawiri means David. It's a transliteration of the name David. You can see there's a cover from the 1883 version. And in English, it says, the Book of Prayers and Other Practices of the Church of England for the Ministry of the Sacraments and Other Practices of the Church and the Songs of David, and the practices for the ordination of bishops, priests, and deacons. It talks about Rawiri, the Songs of David. It's referring obviously to the Psalms, where David's held as a psalmist for a lot of the Psalms. And my father's thoughts, who's written on this, was that it was really important to ascribe an authorship to this. Again, we weren't really big on anonymity in terms of sources, more tia, other sources. We'd always try and think, where was it from? Who was it from? Because anonymous songs, ideas didn't have the power. What's the mana from this? Who is this person who has composed this? Because as my father said, authorship was tied to composition, which was seen as a gift from the gods and inherently tapu. Sacred's a bad interpretation of that, and therefore the accuracy of repetition was all important. Things that were anonymous lacked the mana, the sacredness, the power of things that could be ascribed to someone. And they weren't going to call it after Cranmer. So David, the book is after the ancestor David. That's the name. And every Māori Anglican has called it the Rawiri ever since, even though it's only a small side part of that title. We name it after the ancestors. This is how we build a community around a book. This is how we own a book. This is how a book becomes taonga for us. This is St Mary's Church in Tikitiki, near the East Cape. Again, centre of the universe, if you're looking for it on a map. This church was opened in 1926. It is a profound theological statement of what it means to be Ngāti Porou and Christian. It was designed by our old people, carved by our experts, and it has many, many deep images, ways of thinking about that relationship between Christianity and us as Ngāti Porou in there and how these things blend together. The tukutuku, the weaving patterns in the church, were designed by Sir Apira Ngata. I can't, it seems, do any presentation anymore without mentioning Joe Williams and Apira Ngata, but hey, why not go for the best? And also, I can't believe Joe Williams isn't Ngāti Porou, but that's another story for another day. But Ngata's knowledge is imbued in this church. But I'll just jump to the window. On the left-hand side is Lieutenant Hirini Kaa, who was killed in the Somme in 1916, and on the right-hand side is Captain Pekama Kaa, my grandfather's brother, who was killed in Ypres in 1917, and they're both buried over in Europe. My father had a whanaunga with Paki Harrison, the master carver, once talking about the church, about the images in the church. My father said to him, all right then, so we've got all this Ngāti Porou imagery, and Paki was going through it all. And the only non-Ngāti Porou thing in there then, image, is that of the Christ in the window. And Paki said to him, and please, just some of you will get excited at this idea, but Paki said to him, no, by incorporating him in there, in the way it is done, you've incorporated him into your whakapapa. He is part of what it means to be Ngāti Porou. That font of Taumātakuru you saw before, where he's holding it up, that's at the other end of the church. All these stories are wound through this church. And the idea that the Christ might be part of our whakapapa is radical. And yet we call ourselves, in World War II, our Māori battalion company was called the Cowboys. We call ourselves Wiwi Ngāti as a tribe. Wiwi is a weed, Ngāti is a type of horse. We've incorporated horses into our whakapapa. I'm pretty sure we can incorporate the Christ into our whakapapa as well. This is very unpopular thinking in 2021 in some circles, and yet that's where my evidence leads me in some ways. So getting back to my nan in this book, see Alice, good timing, I'm always there. I can't believe it myself, to be honest. Is this a taonga? Is this a central part of our community? Have we created this to be an important part of our community? And not just this book, which is my grandmother's. This book is sacred. I wouldn't put it near food. I treat it with reverence, partly because it was hers and therefore has that particular power. Not just because it's a prayer book in particular. But Rawiri, does it have kaitiakitanga? Does it have a community that upholds it, is responsible, has obligations to it? Yes, Rawiri do today still. Does it have whanaungatanga and whakapapa? Does it have that sense of connection to others? Possibly not just that sense of connection. Does it have that actual connection to the world, to the environment, to humans, to gods? Possibly. Does it have Māori, that spiritual aspect? I believe it does, but again, that's very subjective. And does it have mātauranga Māori? Does it come from the Māori worldview? Well, I'm not sure about that, obviously. It comes from a series of Jewish stories, which gets passed down through Europe over the centuries, turned by Cranmer and others into this prayer book, passed down to us and translated by other Pākehā, and eventually owned by Māori communities. It's a complicated question, that last one, whether it is mātauranga Māori or not. But I know it was precious to my nan. I think it remains precious to me. And I think it's a way of thinking about books as taonga in our communities as we go forward, and challenging some of our assumptions that we seem to be building around ourselves as Māori, but also strengthening, I think, some of our ideas around how we view the world and our mātauranga, our way of knowledge. So I leave you with those words. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora. Ēnei te mei ki a koe. E hoa. You might want to take a moment to relax a little bit after that beautiful kōrero. Just sharing with all of the people who have been listening, transfixed and excited for the last almost hour. We do have about 20 minutes for discussion, for questions. It would be really great if we erred more on the side of questions than just kind of sermons and reply. I'm sure Hirini's up for a cup of tea with anyone who has hours of kōrero to share with him. But if you did have a question that you would like to ask, I understand the Q&A box isn't happening in the way that it could have done. And so what we're doing instead, and there's a message in the chat to indicate this, if you could just pop your question into the chat, please. So we'll just all sit here and stare at the chat. Here we go, Nigel. Thanks for kicking things off. I'll just read the question, and then Hirini can, respond. So Nigel Bond has asked, was there much resistance to the Māori evangelists from local communities? Was there clashes between customary knowledge and the new messages? Well, there's an easy one. You'll sort that in a sentence, eh?
Oh, yeah.
That's a great start. Thank you.
Buckle up, people. Let's just go and go for an hour, the answer. No, there was constant renegotiation, I call it in my thesis. And I'll just say, just to mess with us, it's still happening today. We're still having that whanaunga, that ongoing discussion about these matters. We always have, we always will. But yeah, there was resistance at the time, definitely. But also huge numbers of just a huge shift for Māori as well. So both.
Kia ora.
Brief, I think. Yeah.
What was that?
Sorry, I could really go for days. So, yeah.
I know. I feel like that's a question that deserves a great answer, which you've provided. And the other alternative for the answer is actual whanaunga, right? So
yeah.
So really, that's a thank you. So Marama Solsano has asked, in what ways might taonga like books be considered ancestral thinking spaces, if at all?
Well, in Y262, because blessed be Joe Williams, as Joe Williams teaches us, they use the example of Ngā Moa Teatea, Apirana Ngāta's and Peter Hurinui Jones collection, curation, collation of ancestral knowledge through song, basically. They collected it from all around the country. And that was held up as the great, that's where whanaungatanga, it has the ancestors imbued in it. So it was the place where ancestors could continue to whanaunga. And Ngāti was worried at the time. People had huge resistance to him putting these things in books because it was sacred and because of the nature of these ancestral thinking spaces, which is a lovely term for it, perhaps, if that's what you're thinking. And yet Ngāti said, if we don't, we'll lose it. So yeah, I think books have been long that fascinating space of those spaces. Yeah.
Kia ora. Oh, they're coming in thick and fast now. Nino Whitaker has said a lot of heritage collections in Aotearoa have these te reo prayer books and other Christian texts with very little other information. How can we connect them back to their histories? What do you look for when you see these puka puka as clues to their whakapapa?
Well, kia ora. First of all, there's this book you can buy.
Shameless. Awesome, it's a great book. Buy it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Another fresh $5 in your way, Alice.
Yes.
Because actually, it is a chapter in the book because there isn't enough around about what are, I think, really important texts for Te Ao Māori. It hasn't really been told that story. So I think it's very important. In terms of, they often have names, text written inside them. This has, in particular, my nan's written some notes and things in the front, which is really precious to me. Often have names. But one of my clergy friends, he's on Trade Me, and as soon as he sees one, he'll pay absolutely anything. So if you want to make some quick cash, just ramp him up. He'll just bid through the moon. But more seriously, I think the context is important, finding out which version it is, which edition, where it's from. Again, these are the youngest, and these are 70 years old now. They didn't print anymore after 1951. So they're all, if antiquity is part of being a taonga, and perhaps it is, I think they're all taonga now in that respect as well.
Kia ora. Paula Piha has said some nice things to thank you for your Atamaria, Dr. Kaa. Thank you for sharing about your nan and her taonga. Marissa Young has asked whether anyone has investigated the relationship between Sunday schools and Bibles in Māori communities.
No, I've done some work on children. You know the deal. I used archival sources, and it's seeing the silences. Women, young people. But having said that, if you read archives in a particular way, with whakapapa, particularly if you've got insider knowledge, you can see some of that as well, where others might not see it. But no, there hasn't been enough. But again, Anglican world, I'm just going to make a broad generalization, but we were people of the prayer book, not necessarily of the Bible. You were more likely to learn off by heart prayer book than you were scripture, for example. So Sunday school too would be about the rawiri and the prayer book as well. But no, I think there's been a few on Pākehā communities, which is great, but no, not enough on Māori young people.
Tom Bishop has said, kia ora Hirini, thank you for that kōrero. How much do we know about how the rawiri psalms were or were not sung as traditional waiata, or using English tunes or recited or whatever?
Well, kia ora, Tom. yeah, it was a point of discussion that Māori, we weren't doing it properly. We're people of a cappella. Now, things I don't tell you when you go to become a minister, I mean, you've observed it, but you've never really thought about it, is you have to be able to sing a hymn pretty much solo on a marae with hundreds of people in a hurricane, while, we're not organ people as a rule. Whereas Pākehā Anglicanism is very reliant on organs for the hymns. We don't have choirs. We're all in as a people. We love singing. It helps as well. So we have our own ways. And also, like ringatu, we would often work with them to the ringatu prophetic movement, the Kōtis people. We'd work with them in terms of borrowing styles from one another as well. So we've got our own, I think, very unique Māori liturgical style, I would put it that way.
Kia ora. Hauea Apiata has said, tēnā rau atu koe Hirini, fascinating kōrero, re the use of Māori concepts in the translation of theological texts. I wonder if you have come across or heard any kōrero about how Māori responded to the use or adoption of their traditional kupu or concepts in these new contexts. For example, like your tohunga priest example, or do you have further whakaaro of your own about that? And I'm just going to jump in and add a little explanatory context. I hope he doesn't mind me doing this. He has just handed in a master's thesis looking at the translation of LDS or Mormon sacred texts. So that's where his nerd energy was just vibing. Providing some context there, but yeah, the idea of those translations.
And my name Hirini is both after my father's brother and after Hirini Whanga, Ihaka Whanga's son, who's buried in Salt Lake City and was the first Mormon missionary. So I have that LDS whakapapa myself from my Kahungunu side, although I'm not allowed to talk about it. Just kidding. Well, again, every third question, there's a book you could purchase or shoplift, I'm not too fast, that has some insights about that. Yeah, it was very, words make worlds, and discussions over the reo were always very powerful places of debate, because everyone knew what was at stake, really. In the 19th century, Māori weren't involved so much, although there is a kind of fascinating story with the Williams, who again, well, Henry Williams did the treaty, for example, so it's not nothing what they thought about that reo. But in the 20th century in particular, there are some really interesting debates. And again, my own father, which is in the book, wrote a communion service using io as the word for God, and it was declined by the Māori Church. All Māori at that hui. Fascinating debate over, and probably not what you're all thinking. It wasn't about, it was an acknowledgement that the concept of io is extremely powerful, is very real, and is, I'm just going to use the word, and I know it's too loaded, but dangerous. You don't lightly use a term like io, and you don't just use it for God. It's not that God's not a powerful word either, but so it was never trying to erase those real concepts. It was saying, play with that at your own risk, because it's real and powerful. And that was the primary reason. Also, the service, of course, was to Ngāti Porou. And it was, Dad deliberately used, work with his brother Hirini Kaa, his sister Arapira Blanc, to use Ngāti Porou concepts, which, other iwi, for some reason, didn't recognise as the greatest source of thought ever. So, who knows?
Kia ora.
So, yes.
Kia ora. Gosh, I feel like this is examination of some kind, because the questions are so, they're such great questions, and there's something about them coming through chat that makes them feel, So we'll get going. We've got 9 minutes left before we get our cup of tea break. So you got to keep singing for your supper here, Hirini, that you then get to make your own supper because, hey, Zoom. So Wanda Yeremia Allen has asked, has said, Talofa Lava, Whawhatai, Dr. Kaa, was there a historical textual relationship between the International Bible Reading Association and Māori prayer book, like the former London Missionary Society prayer books in Samoan? Whawhatai.
I'm sorry, I probably couldn't answer that. The SPCK did the prayer book because the Bible Society, which did the Bible, printed the Māori Bible, it had in its constitution it wasn't allowed to be denominational. So SPCK did denominational books like the Anglican prayer book. Otherwise, sorry, I'm not sure about that particular relationship. Yeah.
Kia ora. Nigel Bond has said, recent Values New Zealand studies and census of the past 10 to 12 years suggest that church numbers are declining across the motu. Young people in particular are leaving the church. Are you aware of similar trends among Māori church membership?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Huge numbers in the census of young Māori ticking the no religion box, which is fascinating in itself because, you know, Ringatu's dropping, although slowly, but Atana's dropping pretty quickly, we're dropping rapidly. The Catholics, similarly. Yeah, no, certainly the place of, you know, Christianity in Te Ao Māori has certainly radically different. I think, you know, it's partly that's the Western world as well, which, hey, we are part of. You know, we like going to the mall on Sunday as much as any other person. You know, we've got the longest working hours in the OECD because of our liberal labour laws. So we don't have really time for whānau, for marae, for church. You know, that there's a lot of dynamics plus decolonization, which is incredibly important. You know, and true, you know, so much of it. So yeah, there's an array of challenges there. But I think, you know, anyway, I think the intellectual question around Christianity, I've been dissatisfied with our conclusions so far. And yet I've been surrounded by these amazing, particularly Pauhere Kōrero, which Alice acknowledged, our Māori History Network. We do all sorts of things, and amazing thinkers, you know, and of course, Māori academia in general is just spectacular. So the challenge for me is to present, to think about evidence, to think about some of these challenges, but also to acknowledge, yeah, I mean, the churches have done bad and we kind of get what we deserve and we've got to answer for that and we've got to change. So yeah, absolutely.
Kia ora. I think maybe Nigel's kind of following on the question. Sociologist Grace Davey refers to believing without belonging. Do you think this is also a trend here in Aotearoa? I wonder if this would be a way to think about the, sorry, Nigel, I hope I'm not completely stealing your question here, but like maybe directing us towards the idea of thinking about what that Awari means in whānau, even if they might be whānau who took no on the census.
Well, you know, that's fascinating. And thank you, Alice, for that, you know, the way of thinking about it, eh? You know, where does this book fit if we're not practicing, if we don't, you know, if it's not part of our life as a taonga? Our friend, our mentor, our colleague, Dr. Aroha Harris, Associate Professor Aroha Harris, who's amazing, talks about, you know, we've had talks about books when they did Tangata Whenua is an amazing book, and other books like my book. I think my book is going to end up in a lot of Mihinare whānau who whakapapa back, and I've had some amazing emails and responses and people coming up to me and kōrero about it. They're not going to read it, or they're not going to read it cover to cover, or they're not going to, you know, like do what the plan was. You need to read it, think this way. It's a taonga. They're going to have it because it's a link to that whakapapa. it is that whakapapa in some ways, in their midst. Yeah, it's believing without belonging. It's claiming identity, even when it's tenuous. And, you know, and Anglican churches, to be honest, anyway, the product itself also needs some work. So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, eh? Like, where do these books fit? Well, I think, you know, well, my nan and my whakapapa, and it's part of who I am, even if I don't fully grasp it, or even I reject parts of that, it's still part of who I am. And it's as a taonga, that's part of what its function is, to maintain that connection.
Kia ora. I am aware we have 4 minutes, according to my laptop, until the end of the session, and I think it's a sign of you know, the quality and amazingness of your kōrero, that we have kind of questions now bubbling up, and some of them really big ones that perhaps can't be dealt with even at an initial go in 4 minutes. So I'll just grab this one more question, and then we might wrap things up. So Tom Bishop has another question. Kia ora again, Hirini. Can you comment on any salient differences in this area between Anglican and non-Anglican Christian denominations, Roman Catholic, Baptist, Dissenter, etc.? For some strange reason, he left Lutheran off the list there, but, you know, hey, let's pop them back in. I'm saying this only because Hirini and I have a long-standing conversations about the place of Māori ministers in our families, and in my case, it was a Māori Lutheran minister. So, kia ora.
Reformer splitters. Yeah, we have very different histories. Obviously, the Māori Anglican Church, why it made a good book was because it goes back all 200 years, like literally to the foundation of the settler state. It doesn't make us look too good, but actually makes for a good story. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, didn't ordain their first Māori Catholic priest until 1948. The Baptists came fairly late. The Salvation Army has a beautiful story and an amazing book. But again, you know, kind of, and the LDS Church, I'm really looking forward to reading more of that work. They're doing some fantastic, but, you know, we're kind of talking 1880s, the first LDS missionaries. So we have different, and we come from different times and different kind of spaces, different relationships with colonization. I mean, the Anglican Church is extremely wealthy today, partly because we got in early with the land. I mean, I'm not even being glib there, you know, like, and so that's different from some other denominations today. Our relationship with the state, with the legacy of colonization, you know, so we're all at different places and different spaces. But the Catholic Church, for example, just changed their missal, and it's funny, you know, people have learned it off by heart suddenly. Hey, why has it gone all funny on me? Or, you know, that kind of. But it's similar in some respects. It's part of whakapapa, part of identity for a lot of fun. So.
Kia ora. So Nina did ask a question. Sorry, I'm just going to zoom up. Nina Whitaker asked a question, which I'm going to ask you to not answer. Chair's prerogative, because it is 10:44. And Nina's question is, could you say a bit more about the relationship between the church and decolonization? And that's been followed up by Suzanne Muntz, who says, I'm sorry if I haven't said your name correctly. Nina's question is huge, and I'm interested in that discussion as well. This is obviously a massive discussion and complex, and I'd like to wrap things up, if that's okay, kind of leaving that as kind of the question that's the elephant question in the room, but also a question that I think you've, you know, obviously engaged quite a bit over the last hour and a quarter. Thank you to everybody for asking all of those amazing questions. And again, I think it speaks to the, you know, the fabulousness of your kōrero to have kind of kicked things off in this way and to have grounded us in really particular ways, and also kind of blown our little brains apart to kind of start making the sorts of connections that people are now making, and questions people are now asking in the chat. So thank you, and thank you for bringing something which is very timely but is something which is also very particular to place. And time and place are two things we all lose track of lockdowns. So it's been really nice. I also wanted to acknowledge, just to wrap up, that I think one of the things that I sometimes feel sad about is the secularization of the Western Academy means we get scared of talking about wairua, but we also get scared of talking about church and churches, religious organizations, which mean a great deal to Indigenous peoples. And when I say we, I mean we as people in the academy, and also we as Indigenous scholars. And you know, your kōrero has sort of demonstrated beautifully both the value and the kind of like amazing sharp work that can happen, engaging with concepts like taonga and mātauranga when the focus is on, in this case, te hāhi Mihinare. But also I think flags for us what we miss intellectually, but also what experiences and parts of our whakapapa that we miss if we don't have these conversations. So thank you, Hirini, so much for bringing this kōrero, sharing it, and promoting your book in such beautiful ways. I do highly recommend the book. You know, there's so many ways we can't really attend to tikanga in an online environment, but given that we opened with karakia, and then there was kōrero, and now we've had something of a sermon, I think all of us who are Māori are probably feeling like it's time to break some tapu and have a cup of tea and something to eat, so that we can continue in a new way with the rest of the program. So I encourage everyone to go and grab a snack. You've got 13 minutes, according to my laptop, to do that before the next session, and that will give us a chance to all kind of re-find our ground and move newly into the day. So tēnei te mihi ki a koe, Hirini, me ngā pai waka aere. Kia ora.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora.